Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our IDRA Ed Policy Summer Camp series. Welcome back, maybe. Today is our Texas Legislative Wrap-Up Education Policy Study Hall. And we just want to say that today's session is recorded and we're also broadcasting to Facebook Live. So hello everyone that's joining us from that platform, if you guys can see me. So yeah, this is our second session in our summer camp series, and the fellows and IDR team are so excited to share some of our highlights and maybe lowlights from this past session. So the point of this session is to review some of those bills that passed and some that maybe didn't. I will be your moderator for today's panel. So as a quick introduction, my name is Samantha. I'm an intern for the PACE, so that's the Policy Advocacy Community Engagement team. So if you hear the word PACE, that's what we're talking about. I'm here at IDRA, and I'm also a master's student studying education policy at the University of Texas. So that's a little bit about me, and we'll go ahead and dive into our panelists' introductions. Great, yeah, so this is in order of our presentations today. So first we have Savina Tapia, who's a fellow PACE intern. Savina is a second-year law student at St. Mary's University School of Law. She graduated from the American University in Washington, D.C. with her degree in law and society, with double minors in education studies and psychology. And today she'll be discussing legislation that impacts the dismantlement of the school to prison pipeline. Following Savina, we have Araceli Garcia. She's one of our wonderful PACE fellows, as well as the rest of the panelists on the page. She grew up in San Antonio to Mexican immigrant parents and grandparents. Araceli graduated from Stanford with a Bachelor of Arts in Chicanx and Latinx Studies and a minor in education. And today, Araceli will cover important bilingual learner and immigrant student education legislation. Following Araceli, we have Dr. Altheria Caldera. She began her career as a middle school English teacher and moved on to become a teacher educator for the last 4 years. She earned her PhD in education studies from the Texas Christian University. And today, Altheria will cover notable legislation that relates to college preparation and access, so specifically expanding those post-secondary opportunities. Next, we have Cristina Munoz. She's a second-generation Latina master's graduate who studied quantitative methods in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She also graduated with her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Texas at San Antonio. So today, Christina will overview important COVID-19 responses in education through legislation. And last but not least, we have Thomas Marshall, originally from Columbia, South Carolina, and a current Houston resident. Thomas attended Clemson University, where he received a degree in English with a minor in youth development studies, and is a current Master's of Education student at the University of Houston. So during our panel, Thomas will discuss digital equity and inclusion through education and community. Yeah, and so those are our panelists today. So to briefly overview our agenda, as you mentioned, the panelists will kind of go through their topic areas, talking about those bills, and they'll present to you all. And then we'll transition into a Q&A session, which I'll help facilitate, where you'll get the chance to use the Zoom function, and of course, feel free to use that chat box through their presentations. But during that time specifically, you'll be able to ask questions that we can direct to the panelists just for their insight and knowledge through this past session in those topic areas. And then we'll preview a few resources as well as the continuation of this summer camp series. And that's kind of what we have today. Before we really dive in, we just want to say one thing about kind of the language we're using today. So you'll hear the words harmful and beneficial, and that's kind of a reflection of IDRA's mission to towards educational equity, and specifically with a focus of students of color. So when we say harmful and beneficial, that is in reference to what the fellows and what IDRA believes to be harmful and beneficial to students of color, as well as educational equity at large. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'll pass it to Savina.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam, for all the introductions, and good evening, everyone. So like Sam said, I will be presenting on the ending harmful discipline and policing in schools, and specifically related to the dismantlement of the school to prison pipeline. So as we all know, there are many school safety measures, including the use of police presence inside schools, arming teachers, and using unnecessary surveillance systems and barriers. to essentially address security and behavior within schools. We know that these practices aren't based in research and that they end up doing more harm than good to students and negatively impact school climates. Schools use police officers and other forms of administrative safety to control and punish students. And although there's no evidence backing these practices, police officers are able to patrol campuses, arrest students, and collaborate with other agencies like immigration and use force to address student behavior and needs within the classroom. And we also know that harmful and overtly punitive punishments send students out of the classroom and thus create a barrier to their education and academic success. Discriminatory practices and punishments make schools less safe and less welcoming for students. And they also impact the perceptions of education and teaching and teachers and administrators as a whole than the actual behaviors that need to be addressed within the student population. School policies and practices should be fair and appropriate and should focus on building strong and trusting relationships between students and the adults in their schools. If our slide navigator wouldn't mind moving to the next slide for me. Thank you. And so on the scene, my apologies, on the slide, we have a little statistic about the disproportionate impact of school punishment on Black and Brown students. Recently in Texas, and honestly, this is a trend across the country, communities have adopted school safety measurements in response to high-profile violent tragedies in schools. And unfortunately, a lot of these measures include the increased presence of police inside school, which essentially doesn't address the overall concern. And again, really harms students more than it benefits them. Recently, a study conducted in Texas found that 97% of punishments weren't mandatory and that the racial disparities within this punishment data were only present when teachers and administrators had the discretion to identify and punish said behaviors. And so obviously this evidence in this data continues to uphold the idea, the proven fact that Black and Brown students are disproportionately subject to the school to prison pipeline and punishment within school more than their peers. And so some of the legislation that I'm about to talk about contributes to the dismantlement of the school to prison pipeline and really addresses these pinpoints of where we can improve and areas that we still need to work on. So I will first address some really beneficial legislation that came out of this session. So our first bill at hand is SB 41, and SB 41 essentially repeals juvenile probation diversion fees and DNA testing fees when juveniles are sent to the juvenile courts. Historically, juvenile court fines and fees and things like restitution create significantly long-term harm to children and their families. Juvenile fines and their associated court fees disproportionately impact children of color and children from low-income backgrounds. So SB 41 impacts students, particularly students of color, by eliminating these fines and fees that burden them and their families and increases their likelihood that they will stay out of the criminal justice system. So that is one method of really addressing one of the factors in why students are subject to the school to prison pipeline. By repealing these fees, we are allowing students and families who have previously been in these systems to have that economic freedom and not be burdened by these fees and things like restitution. Our next bill is HB 30. So HB 30 is a bill that expands and provides access to secondary education for people who are incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And so, as we all know, again, time after time, that students and people of color are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. And we know that incarceration often interrupts people's education. And when incarcerated, it's more difficult to obtain education because you're incarcerated. And HB 30 basically provides that students, individuals who are incarcerated will have access to educational opportunities that will provide them a high school diploma. And this will allow people under the age of 18 to obtain their diploma while incarcerated. And then it also extends to people who might need special education and are over the age of 18. So it also allows people who aren't necessarily in that traditional pathway to also receive their education. And so we all know that education is the gateway to social and economic mobility, and even more so for people who are incarcerated. And so this bill really allows essentially a small fix to a larger issue in access to education for people of color. And maybe go to our next slide, please. Thank you very much. And so bills to watch and some missed opportunities from this legislative session include HB 785, HB 1525, and HB 38. And I'm going to go through each of them and give everyone a little background and some insight as to what was missed and where we can improve for the future. So the bills highlighted in yellow on the screen have been adopted as legislation. While they are beneficial, there are definitely areas that can be improved in regards to the student experience and the dismantlement of the school to prison pipeline. So we'll start off with HB 785 first. HB 785 was created to address the behavior plans for students who are receiving special education. And so this bill requires that individual education program committees review their behavioral improvement plans, and also requires notification to parents and guardians that restraints are used on students with disability. And that's one of the big takeaways for this legislation. The requirement for parental notice creates a system of accountability between school districts who are using force and restraint on students to the parents whose children are subject to restraint. We know that restraint is definitely a physical and emotionally harmful practice. And so although this system still is in place, we are doing small steps forward in creating accountability, and in the hopes that this practice won't be needed in the future. Students with disability are often disproportionately represented in the numbers of students who are restrained while they're in school, especially in regards to seclusion and physical restraint. And so this bill will also help provide data that we can analyze and use to advocate for better behavioral and social emotional supports for students with disabilities. And then our next bill is HB 1525. So HB 1525 adds language as to how school districts can use their school safety allotment funds. And so this bill impacts students of color by creating avenues that are both beneficial and avenues that we need to watch moving forward in regards to school safety funding. So the language that's been added in this bill definitely allows school districts to continue on the pathways that they have been using for this funding. However, it also expands language to things that are beneficial to students of color, such as evidence-based practices being used to address behavioral issues and social issues within school, as well as providing and increasing the presence and the amount of school counselors in school and mental health resources. So that's definitely an area that was beneficial within this bill. However, this bill also does allow for continued practices like police presence in school to still be used. And so how these school districts continue to manage their funds in regards to school safety is definitely an area of interest for IDRA and the education scene as a whole, seeing which kinds of trends in regards to school safety continue to be popular within school districts, and what new data is going to come out with districts that do decide to go the alternate route and use alternative based practices other than police and other related safety measures. And then our last bill is HB 38. So HB 38 did not pass this legislative session. So this bill is also known as the Crown Act. And the Crown Act was a missed opportunity to protect students of color from discrimination in the school environment. So Black and Brown students are 3 to 6 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school. And today there remains a regressive movement that continues to criminalize Black hairstyles under the idea that schools and the professional setting are preparing them for the real world. And these are discretionary suspensions. Discretionary suspensions related to Black hairstyles are honestly and completely shameful and disproportionately applied to these students. Black students are also more likely to be suspended for discretionary reasons, such as dress code or hair violations, neither of which have been found to be related to school misconduct. And discretionary suspensions aren't required by law, but yet they are deeply impacting our students of color. And so the Crown Act would have definitely, if enacted, created a safer space for students of color, especially Black students within our school system. And hopefully within the next round of legislative sessions and in the future, we can see acts like this being enacted to protect our Black and Brown students. And so that is the end of my legislative wrap up, and I will pass it on to Araceli.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So we also have some really exciting advances for emergent bilingual students this session, also known as English learner students, or in the Texas Education Code, previously known as limited students with limited English proficiency. That is no longer the case, and we'll get into that for a little bit. But first, I want to contextualize a little bit about who are these students and why is it so important that we support them. So next slide, please. So this is the number, 1,052,172 students are currently in the state of Texas learning English as a second language in school. So that's 20% of all Texas students are emergent bilingual. It gets even higher if you look at students in pre-K through third grade, so our really young students. 28% of all students in pre-K through third grade are emergent bilingual students. So this is a huge proportion of our population in Texas. Texas educates the highest proportion of emergent bilingual students, more than any other state in the nation. So this is a really, really pressing issue for us, yet we often see that the legislature tends to not touch on issues that affect emergent bilingual students. They're sort of the elephant in the room. Nobody really wants to talk about them, especially when we talk about education. But there have been some bright spots this session. So that was in huge thanks to a lot of our families. We were able to pass 4 pieces of legislation. These 3 of these came out of an early childhood English learner initiative. It was a joint initiative between IDRA, Texans Care for Children, and a few other organizations that decided to come together and put together a roadmap, something that's really forward-looking for our state, not just with policy recommendations for the legislature, but also recommendations for the Texas Education Agency, TEA, and for local and district level recommendations for how we can support and implement high quality bilingual education programs. In addition to that, we also put out a bilingual education primer. So this is a great resource. We can drop it in the chat, but basically it breaks down the history of bilingual education in Texas, where we are now and where we need to go. So this joint initiative between putting together a primer, putting together a roadmap, and then activating families in our community led to the passage of these 4 bills. So SB 560 creates a state strategic plan for bilingual education. So I mentioned all those huge numbers, proportions of students in Texas who are emergent bilinguals, but the state has never had a strategic plan for ensuring that those students are receiving a high quality education. And they just didn't have a plan for that until now. So now we'll have a state strategic plan that will have meaningful goals and benchmarks for how many certified bilingual educators we'll have in the state by a certain year, how many high quality dual language immersion programs we'll have available, and also how many of our students will be graduating biliterate and bilingual by the time they graduate from high school. So this is a huge advancement and something that will give the state something to work toward at the very least. We also have HB 2256, which creates a new special education certification for teachers and school leaders. So this is critical. Other states with a smaller proportion of emergent bilingual students actually already have this certification available to them. Texas did not. And so this will require working with some of our higher education institutions to make sure that we can offer a high quality certification program for teachers. And I also include school leaders in there because anyone who pursues this certification would be qualified to teach essentially 3 kinds of classrooms, one with bilingual students, one with special education students, and to also meet the needs of students who sit at the intersection of both bilingual education needs and learning or developmental disability. So often what the situation was the bilingual education teacher and the special education teacher would sort of coordinate and try to figure something out. But often those students, as you can imagine, will fall through the cracks. And we're talking about tens of thousands of students that we know of. And so the other component of this is that it will allow and train teachers and other professionals to be more qualified to accurately assess the needs of students. Oftentimes we get a situation where a student is misclassified as needing special education, or when in reality they need bilingual education, or vice versa, or sometimes both, and one of them is not classified. So those needs are not being met, or people are meeting the wrong needs. And so that all comes from a lack of training. And we hope that this certification will allow more people the capacity to be able to accurately meet the needs of students. We also have SB 2066. Y'all have heard me use the term just now of emergent bilingual students. This is now the law, well, starting September 1st. That will be the language of the law in Texas. So Texas will be the first state in the entire country to transition to asset-based language for students who are learning English as a second language in school. So as I mentioned before, the language in the education code, Texas Education Code, which is the law, referred and identified these students as limited English proficient, or English learners or English language learners. These terms are deficit-based. They focus on what students have yet to learn versus all the strong skills that they already bring into the classroom. And so we wanted to change that. And we know that this is a symbolic shift more than anything. But what we're hoping to accomplish with this symbolic shift now is really a change in how people view and think about students who are learning English in schools. They're often seen as a monolith. Everyone thinks that all the students learning English in school are Latinos and Spanish speakers, when we know that's not the case. Over 70 languages are spoken in homes across the state of Texas. So we need to stop thinking of our students as a monolith. And people often think that they're difficult and expensive to educate. Rather than seeing educating students who are bilingual and graduating students who are bilingual as an asset to our entire state, because really that's what it is. And so with this shift to emergent bilingual, we're able to capitalize on seeing the potential that these students have for bilingualism, potential for being engaged with their communities, and really just in a few years, maybe in a few sessions, when the topic of funding for bilingual education comes up again, we'll be able to point to our students as an asset rather than a deficit or a drain on our state. And finally, SB 2081 deals with PreK class size limits. So as many of you know, there are class size limits for many grade levels in Texas, all of them except for PreK until now. And the reason why we designate this as an emergent bilingual student issue is because PreK, as I mentioned, is heavily influential in the success of all students, but especially emergent bilingual students. As I mentioned before, PreK through third grade, when you look at those early grades, 28% of those students in those classrooms across Texas are emergent bilingual students. So if we're not setting a strong educational foundation for students starting in PreK with enough teacher attention for them, then they are not being set up to be successful. Many of you might know that PreK is people who are students who are learning English or who don't know English yet automatically qualify for free PreK in the state of Texas. So many of the PreK participants actually are emergent bilingual students. And so we want to make sure we give those students the best chance possible to be successful, starting with those early grades. So the PreK class size limit will be 11 students to one teacher, and a classroom will be capped at 22 students per teacher and an aide. So we recognize this as a really foundational step in the education of students. And though I don't have a slide for harmful bills, because thankfully this session, we were able to defend against the few bills that came up that could have been harmful for emergent bilingual students, we don't want to give the impression that Texas is necessarily doing everything that it can do to support bilingual students in their education. The bilingual education allotment has not been increased from 10% in over 30 years. So this is something when I say that the legislature is very, there's never an appetite for increasing the funding for emergent bilingual students. There was the possibility of increasing the bilingual education allotment that's used on direct program costs that the legislature chose not to take up. That bill did not move. So there are areas, huge areas for improvement as far as bilingual education goes, but these are some really exciting advances, and we hope to have a strong implementation process for all of these to ensure that our students are successful. And with that, I will pass it to our next speaker.
Thank you, Araceli. And I should probably add that Araceli is being modest, but much of the legislation that she just described is work that she led. And without her efforts, these bills would not have passed. So kudos to you, Araceli, for leading this great work in this really important area. My area of advocacy for the legislative session was in expanding post-secondary opportunities for all. A college education expands learning and career opportunities, but it also improves life opportunities in general. Despite these clear benefits, many schools are not preparing all students to graduate and have access to college. Too often, students are pushed into courses and programs that do not prepare them or even prevent them from meeting the requirements necessary for college admission. Students of color, students from families with limited incomes, students from rural communities, immigrant students, and others who have been disproportionately unsupported by their schools and excluded from college opportunities for generations deserve equitable educational opportunities to prepare them to succeed in college. And this policy area basically has three components. We look at college preparation or higher ed preparation, access to post-secondary opportunities, and you'll notice that I use post-secondary and higher education interchangeably. They mean the same thing. I'm referring to education past high school when I'm using post-secondary and higher education. So we focus on access, meaning the ease of enrolling into college and removing barriers that prevent students from easily enrolling. And the last one we're talking about is affordability, managing costs associated with college. And I'll start by looking at the harmful bills that came up in this session. And fortunately, you'll see here by each of these harmful bills is a DNP. That means these bills did not pass. So that's a really good thing because they were harmful bills. The first one is HB 1486. And for HB 1486 was a bill that's really important to students who are undocumented because it would have limited their ability to claim resident status. And you might wonder, why is it important that they have the ability to claim resident status if they're undocumented? Well, it means that they can then receive in-state tuition from the state public institutions, and it opens them up to be able to receive various forms of financial aid. So there was a bill, this bill was proposed, was filed in hopes of denying them that opportunity. And fortunately, it did not pass. A second one is related to the top 10% plan. The top 10% plan guarantees automatic admission to public universities and colleges in Texas for any students who graduate within the top 10% of their class. And this was a bill that was being proposed to put a cap on that percentage to 30% of the incoming class would be top 10% students. Well, that 30% cap would drastically limit the number of students of color who gain automatic admission to the state's top tier institutions. And so this is one that I personally offered testimony on in the Capitol when this hearing came up. And we're delighted that through combined efforts, this one did not pass as well. The next one is HB 2554. And this one was a pro-charter bill that was designed to establish vocational charter school districts. And this bill is harmful for two reasons. One, it expands charter schools in Texas taking money out of traditional public schools and putting them into these privatized schools. But the second reason it is equally bad reason is because these would be vocational schools. These would not be schools that prepare students for college study. So these would be schools that are meant to prepare students for jobs right out of high school. And the reason that is problematic is because these students would be able to take almost half of their coursework in vocational courses, and these courses would not render them college prepared should they decide that they want to go to college instead of going directly into the workforce. So these three did not pass. And I know we're saying a lot. That's why we've allotted some time at the end for your questions and comments. So two beneficial bills that passed, I'm delighted to share. HB 1277 requires that school districts designate a counselor if they have or offer dual credit courses. And this is important because dual credit students are in a space where they're not quite college students, but they're a little bit more than high school students. So because they have both of these roles that they're not fully in either one completely, they need counselors to provide them advice about the high school credits and the college credits. And importantly, too, the benefits and the dangers of enrolling in dual credit courses early on. So because this bill passed, high schools now will have to designate a school counselor for students who are enrolled in dual credit courses. It is almost like having a college advisor on campus, because if they were fully college students, they'd have advisors on their college campus. And through this bill, they'll have somewhat of an advisor, a college advisor on their high school campuses. The next one that passed is HB 999. And this one is an important one because of COVID, and it expires next September. It is not a permanent one. This is a bill that is just in response to students who may have struggled during the pandemic. And it says that now these independent graduation committees, and you'll see it abbreviated here as IGC, these individual graduation committees no longer have to determine whether a student should pass, a high school student, senior should graduate because of end of course assessments. So it eliminates the requirement for students to pass end of course assessments to graduate from high school. This, like I said, is temporary. It expires September 2022. Missed opportunities. And there were three that I worked on pretty closely that did not get passed. SB 1703 is another bill related to counselors because this is an important part of the preparation of students for higher education. And it would have required counselors to undergo implicit bias training to prevent them from funneling students of color into low-level coursework, into vocational coursework, because historically, these are the populations that have been tracked into low-level coursework. And we just want to make sure that counselors are aware of their biases, they're aware of this history, and that they do not shovel these students into low-level coursework. Again, it did not pass. Next one, SB 1709 was a major one. It had lots of interest from stakeholders in higher education, did not get a hearing. And it would have required institutions of higher education to create faculty equity and diversity plans. And the goal of this bill was to cause colleges and universities to increase the number of faculty or the percentage of faculty in their institutions, and in hopes that having a more diverse faculty will improve the outcomes for students of color. Because right now there is a disproportionate percentage of students in comparison to faculty of color. The last one did not pass that I'll talk about is HB 1504. And this one was another one that had lots of momentum and lots of advocates around this one. It would have allowed or permitted students to receive social studies credits for ethnic studies courses such as Mexican American studies, African American studies, and so on. Right now, these courses are being offered as electives. Had this bill passed, they would have been able to use these courses as part of their required social studies requirement. The good news, a bit of good news about preparation for higher ed is in funding. $8.6 billion increase. For allotted for funding for higher ed, and this is a $486 million increase to the current biennium. And 1.5 billion of this we happily announced or is going to financial aid programs in Texas to be able to address that college affordability issue, and 866 million going to Texas grants. And Texas grants are mainly for our need-based financial aid. Another 178 million going to tuition equalization grants, and 88.5 million to Texas Educational Opportunity Grants. And so these are all positives that will undoubtedly impact affordability for traditionally underserved students. And I will pass it on to our next presenter, Christina.
Thank you so much, Altheria. Yes, as part of my fellowship, I spent a lot of time advocating for legislation that would ensure an equitable response to COVID-19. So as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic surely exacerbated festering inequities within the Texas K-12 public education systems, and schools had to make significant adjustments to the ways that they teach and support students in response to changing health guidelines at that. And these adjustments included halting traditional in-person instruction to facilitate learning in a virtual remote capacity. And this definitely demonstrated even deeper rifts among deeply rooted educational inequities in school funding, technological resources and connectivity, and the ways schools engage families, especially in school districts serving large populations of students of color, emergent, bilingual, or English learner students, and students from households with low incomes. So as part of my fellowship advocacy work, I spent a lot of time promoting schools' engagement of students and their families, promoting increased access to student mental health services, cultivating student advocacy, and helping to bridge the digital divide. And before I introduce some of the pieces of legislation that IDRA worked to advocate around during the legislature, I did want to plug a few resources for those who are really wanting to stay engaged in some of our work. The first being the Learning Goes On Hub, which is for materials, webinars, and other information and resources that is meant to ensure families and educators can best support students' learning. And then the second is the Brief by Texas Tribune, which is a weekly newsletter for Texas voters and community members so that they can stay connected to any policy updates that impact us most. This was a really great resource to me that I found a lot of great information that I was able to share with my advocacy partners, the community members. So for those of you wanting to stay engaged in this kind of work, please use these resources. Coming soon, I put these here just as little tidbits, as little kind of introductions to what's to come. So the first is that our fellows were producing post-session policy updates and detailed bill analyses that will come out soon to look forward to. Some community one-pagers to educate community members about the way these bills may impact them and what we can do in the meantime for bills that didn't pass during the legislature, but what we can do in the meantime to still promote those initiatives. And then lastly, please look out for the Ed Policy Series sessions on federal COVID relief funds as they're relating to racial justice, emergent bilingual students, and students only sessions that are available. So please stay engaged and connected with us. So to kind of go into a lot of the work behind the advocacy during my fellowship, here I put an infographic that demonstrates kind of the theme of the work that we did. So Texas Education Agency in October 2020 released a report that stated Texas public schools lost touch with 1 in 10 students, which is more than 600,000 students at the start of the pandemic. Additionally, the agency reported that schools lost touch with Black students and Latino students at over twice the rate of white students. So this was certainly a startling statistic, which resonated with me throughout my advocacy work as a fellow, and in thinking about how the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated those festering inequities that I mentioned earlier. So the topic of student engagement really became my lighthouse to the work in thinking about the way the Texas legislature could support schools and key personnel such as teachers, administrators, mental health professionals in responding equitably to these issues, ensuring families and students were best supported during this unprecedented period of time. So some of the beneficial bills that made it through the session that passed were SB 179 by Senator Lucio. So this bill expands school counselors' capacity to deliver critical counseling services to students by requiring school districts to adopt a policy that requires a school counselor to spend at least 80% of their work time providing such services directly to students. So as students come back to school in the fall, this will be very critical in terms of the residual outcomes we know students experience, teachers included, during the COVID pandemic. So this is very critical and a huge win for access to mental health services for students and their families. The second was HB 2287 by Representative Symphonia Thompson. This particular bill is actually helping the state to monitor and maintain mental health resources that the TEA, or the Texas Education Agency, will have the authorization to evaluate impacts of these programs and services on certain student success outcomes and overall well-being to inform the Collaborative Task Force on Public School Mental Health Services. Quite a tongue twister, but this will ensure students receive the most effective mental health support, again, as they transition back into schools, so in-person schooling. So these two pieces of legislation and definitely other important student mental health initiatives will significantly boost access to mental health services for students that may be grappling with residual mental and emotional health concerns for prolonged stress and social alienation brought forth by the COVID pandemic. And additionally, these two pieces of legislation passed with tremendous advocacy work. Mental health advocates IDRA was very closely aligned with during the legislative session. So I did want to uplift those coalition spaces that we were a part of. IDRA specifically played a great role in advocating for these bills through convenings in the spring with students who shared experiences and concerns about their learning during COVID-19. Specifically, students were concerned about barriers the digital divide posed while engaging in online learning, and some negative health outcomes experienced by prolonged exposure to screen time and social alienation from their peers. Additionally, IDRA led some groundbreaking student participatory action research that served to uplift student voices in the advocacy and policymaking space. This was made possible through Seek Common Ground and was led, I will give a shout out to our Deputy Director of Advocacy, Ana Ramon, who is on this call. As a fellow, I was able to collaborate on some of this work through student training of the questionnaire design, survey item construction, and analysis. But this was really a neat project that allowed students to become the researchers and investigate their own research questions about education equity, home stressors, at-home learning, and discipline in school. Students who are part of this project developed policy recommendations for these issues and rightfully centering them as solution seekers in a process that impacted them most. And so a lot of their work and findings was used to inform the testimony crafted behind these two particular bills. So IDRA did submit some written testimony to support advocacy partners in passing these key pieces of legislation, which we are very excited about. Next, the bills that I dropped here represent some missed opportunities and definitely areas that we note that during the legislature didn't see enough energy behind. So while the legislature definitely demonstrated progress in addressing critical issues, such as the digital divide that my colleague Thomas will talk more about, and student access to mental health services and resources, there were definitely missed opportunities to bridge widening equity gaps in students' engagement and safety and wellness at school. The first was SB 178 by Senator Lucio. This bill would have increased student to counselor ratios in schools over a 9-year period to meet recommendation ratios by the American School Counselor Association. This particular bill had quite a robust fiscal note behind it, and so it did slip through the fiscal cracks of this session, although this still is a really important step in allowing access to students and mental health resources for them. The next was HB 4391 that was thankfully authored, or it was sent in by James Talarico, Representative Talarico, and IDRA also lent language to this particular bill. But this bill was unique in that it would have addressed startling patterns of disengagement by school districts, as I mentioned earlier, and their families during the pandemic. So the intention behind this particular bill and why it was filed was to try and help bridge those widening equity gaps in engagement through the transition to online formats. So this particular bill sought to require that each district in the state of Texas would develop student engagement plans and family engagement plans in collaboration with key stakeholders that would promote those really authentic engagement moments and would set up some really great communication systems between families and their schools. Lastly, I want to note that there were many pieces of legislation that unfortunately did not meet the light of day that really would have spoken to data equity. So I did note reasons why this is really important. Data collection and disaggregation by racial ethnic identity would be really important. The first was students who are labeled as at risk and chronically absent. The disaggregation of this data would help to figure out solutions to some programs that would be able to promote better services to students who may be experiencing this. Students who receive punitive discipline, public school accountability systems, accelerated learning outcomes, and school district indicators of digital equity. I did want to highlight a particular piece of resources here. The first is the plugged in, tuned out issue brief that I was able to help prepare during the legislative session. So this particular issue brief spoke to the disengagement patterns that Texas saw in its public schools. So in many parts of Texas, student disengagement during the pandemic was a direct result of limited broadband access. And so this brief and this report really represents just the tip of the iceberg of some of the research that will come out of some of the issues that were seen during the COVID pandemic. But those, again, also speak to the inequities that existed prior to, just that were exacerbated. So in this issue brief, IDRA examines the relationship between access to broadband internet services prior to the pandemic and then student engagement patterns in the spring 2020, which was at the start of the pandemic. So this includes data on how student engagement patterns differed across school district sizes, showing broadband internet access was actually a significant predictor of full student engagement for larger, more urban school districts. So in this particular issue brief, during the legislative session, IDRA called for specific key actions to address the divide that were kind of encapsulated in some of the bills that I mentioned earlier as missed opportunities. So I worked really closely with Thomas, our next fellow here, regarding digital equity and inclusion pieces of legislation. And so this is a really great segue into his part of the presentation. So I will let you take it from here.
Thank you so much. So today I'm going to be going over digital equity and inclusion, otherwise known as the digital divide, which refers to the inequities within broadband internet access. Just to give a quick definition, digital equity is a condition in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in society, democracy, and economy. So if you head over to the next slide, you'll be able to see just the sheer inequities that we have here in Texas. Texas was one of 6 states without a state broadband plan. You can see there's almost 2 million households that don't have access to high-speed internet. But we can go ahead to the next slide. So here at IDRA, a part of my fellowship was to really get down to the weeds to figure out what we could do in terms of building community around this subject in digital equity and inclusion. As you can see in reading this quote, this is from a college student that did not have access to the internet and really had to work hard to be able to get that. Along with my fellow Christina, we talked about some briefs that we produced. This was another one that we were able to produce called Digital Destination, which really talked about the racial justice in urban school district correlation between internet connectivity. We found that a lot of times Black and Latinx students had less access to computers, basic internet, broadband access, and those students face substantial barriers with the low proportion of households with school-age children end up having access to the internet. We can go to the next slide. So part of these things that we wanted to address or help be able to advocate for were a couple of these bills. So we had a couple of beneficial bills, which are really good. HB 5, you might have heard of it, the Omnibus Broadband Bill, ended up creating a statewide broadband plan, a statewide broadband development office. It would award grants and low interest loans and other incentives so we can have broadband access for these communities that need it most. And it's really important because we have public comments on this bill. We also partnered with MALC, the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, to be able to have Vice Chair Ana Hernandez of the of the House State Affairs Committee to be able to have legislation and add an amendment to be sure that urban school districts have representation on the Governor's Broadband Council, which is a council that really is the driving force within broadband and making recommendations to the Texas legislature. As well as we see HB 129, unfortunately, it did not pass, but I think I'd be remiss if I did not talk about it. It would have created a digital citizenship course for 6th grade students across Texas and being sure that students have a healthy relationship with the internet and also learn how to disseminate different information on the internet as well. We can head to the next slide. These are a couple bills to watch. I just want to put these on alert because both of these did pass, and I wanted to make sure that these are bills that are going to be coming up in school district conversations, and I think it's important to be able to talk about these bills. So HB 3261 would require all school districts to move all assessments to an online digital format. So at its first point, it does facilitate a transition for these state assessments, and it does institute a grant matching program so we make sure students are able to qualify and understand and have these internet connectivity needs. Some of these unintended consequences that we talk about with this bill is digital literacy. A lot of times we don't account for students of color specifically being able to navigate the internet. We kind of have dispelled this digital native, which we think every student, just because they're born within like the ages of the internet, know how to access and know how to navigate it. That's not necessarily true. We definitely need to make sure that we have proper digital literacy training in place to really take these assessments. On the other side, HB 4545 would institute an accelerated instruction program for high quality education. And so remove statutory requirements for grades 5 through 8 to pass their required reading and math exams for promotion to the next grade, and will provide these accelerated learning committees. A part of that, though, is making sure that, again, digital literacy is at the forefront of these committees and being sure that we address the digital divide within these inequities for these students to help them pass these assessments. You can go to the next slide, please. A couple of missed opportunities. Unfortunately, SB 1799 would have created a high-speed internet access grant program for school districts to get broadband funding. We just saw Dallas ISD, they're putting up Wi-Fi towers and things like that, which is really great ways to be able to help solve the digital divide, not only within the school, but the surrounding community around it. We need to move to more sustainable ways like that to be able to get folks internet. And not a bill specifically, but things that need to be done are more digital equity studies. And this just means that local residents use community surveys, use data from residents to create maps to really get down to the granular level data, because we'd love to live in a world where we see every single household and we know which one has access and which one does not. And digital equity studies can be a part of that solution. We can head to the next slide. So what can you do? As community members, it's really important. I kind of broke it down in a 3-step process. Join a digital inclusion network. In San Antonio, we have the Digital Inclusion Alliance of San Antonio that works to bridge the gaps of digital divide with communities and come up with community solutions, because folks know who needs internet access and has the answers towards that. Second one is connect with nonprofits for federal funding. The Federal Communications Commission, otherwise known as the FCC, has released emergency broadband benefits. And so a part of the American Rescue Plan dollars, those are going to be funneling down to our state broadband office. And there will be nonprofits and other entities able to apply for that funding. We need to make sure that our communities are at the helm of being able to get that funding and get deployment for broadband. And thirdly, assess your coverage. Thinking about how much you pay for internet right now, what's the speeds? Is it the most affordable? Those are really important things that you can just do in your home and contacting your service provider to figure out, is this the most equitable way that I'm getting internet? You can head to the next slide. Just want to highlight a couple of resources. The National Digital Inclusion Alliance is a grassroots community engagement team that really bridges technology, research, and coalition building to make sure that digital equity is at the helm of these communities, as well as lit communities. We work with them a lot in coalition, a builder and operator of the next generation of network infrastructure, and really works as a consultant to make sure that we get fiber optic utilities out in our cities. So that is all I have for digital inclusion and equity, and I'm going to pass it back to Sam for our Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, and thank you to our panelists. Lisa, I see your hand up. I just want to acknowledge time really quickly. I know some of you might have to leave right at 7, and so we just want to thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and drop a couple links in our chat right now regarding, so this is just one session in our series. So next week, same time, we'll have a session regarding the spending of federal relief funds. And then I've also linked kind of the compilation of our past recordings, so last week's and today's, and then our next sessions. And yeah, and with that, Lisa, if you wanted to go off mute and if you had a question, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I wanted to ask for Thomas, what was the number again of residents that do not have internet service?
Absolutely. So it's 1,754,188 million.
Thank you.
That don't
Thank you
have
for that.
households with it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And now we'll just take any questions. I don't think we have any from Facebook, but if you guys want to raise your hand or just use the chat, I can definitely call on you. And I'll give a few seconds just to see. But otherwise, I think one question, and I think Thomas, Christina, you covered this a little, but if there are ways to, ways or advice of ways to advocate or kind of get community involved in your issue areas, I just wanted to take this time and see if you guys had any thoughts on that. And I also see one more.
IDRA actually has education cafes. This is a way that local community folks can get involved in a local effort to better something about their school or school district. So these are very localized groups. And if anyone is interested in that, if there are any parents or parent advocates or advocates who work with parents who want to start an education cafe, there's something you'd like to see. Thank you, Sam, with the really well-timed links in the chat. We would love to support any work with that, and we've empowered several groups in the Valley and also other education cafe groups over IDRA's tenure to be able to change policies in their local districts, and also been able to elevate that policy work to a state level. So if you do know anyone or you yourself are interested in that, click on the link and reach out to us.
Yeah, thank you. And Althea, Savina, if you had any thoughts on involvement or community engagement.
I'll let Althea go first.
I just like to encourage those who are here with us. If you've heard something that is supposed to be happening in your local community, say for instance, I talked about HB 1277. That mandates now that high schools that offer dual credit courses have an assigned or designated dual credit advisor. Make sure that's happening in your local communities. It's state law. They should be assigning dual credit advisors if they're offering dual credit courses. So that is my advice. If you see something that has become law, make sure, especially if it's impacting your local schools, make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Show up at the board meetings and ask the question. Have you all assigned dual credit advisors whenever there are dual credit courses offered at high schools?
Yeah, absolutely. And Sabina, if you had anything to add.
Along similar lines shared by Althea, ensuring that you're holding your community and your school districts accountable for the policies that they're enacting and how they're using their resources. At the end of the day, the money that's distributed in the school allotment funds are your taxpayer dollars. And so you should have a say about how they're used within your school district, especially if your children are students of these school districts, and not even just for the benefit of self, but the benefit for your community as a whole.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I just want to also amplify a question that went on in the chat, just in case you don't have access to it right now. So Aurelia had asked if a local group wants to get digital divide money, who would they apply to? And Thomas replied, the statewide broadband office is currently being developed. So that's something to look out for. And Thomas, if you wanted to expand on that, feel free, and otherwise.
Yeah, no, there's certain provisions, a part of House Bill 5, that will have different entities like folks that focus on digital literacy or nonprofits that focus on digital inclusion that will be able to apply for some of this grant funding that's going to be coming in. So when the office ends up being developed, that's something that nonprofits like IDRA and other coalition spaces are going to take a look out for, because we understand that we're not able to get folks broadband who need it tomorrow, but it's going to be a long-standing issue, and making sure that we're continuing to advocate and making sure we're amplifying the community voices that need to be at the forefront of those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Thomas. I'm going to give it another 20 seconds just in case a question pops up in anyone's head. But otherwise, as Araceli said, you can definitely reach out to us. I think Christina is dropping her email. So we're going to I'll brush through a few of the resources that we have to offer. And if any of you have any resources as well, please feel free to drop those in the chat. But essentially, we know that there will be a special session on July 8th. There are some topics speculated, and linked here is the Tribune piece, and I'll link it in our chat as well. There are more past failed bills, another Texas Tribune piece, and then we wanted to link our policy advocacy and community engagement team, the Education Cafe networks that Araceli had mentioned, as well as TLEC, which is our Texas Legislative Education Equity Coalition, and then kind of an article about local government in San Antonio specifically. So I've linked all of those, kind of dumping all of those in the chat right here. And if Althea, you want to click to the next slide for us. Thank you. And again, this is one part of our summer camp series, and we hope that you're able to join us for the next few and kind of join those conversations. Linked above the chat is next week's registration link for spending federal relief funds, as well as registration links for all the other sessions for this summer. And with that, I think if you want to click this to our next slide, Arthea, thank you. Please feel free to, please feel free to stay connected, join our email list. And I think there are some personal emails in our chat now if you had any other existing questions, but based on those topic areas. But yes, please stay connected. And we just want to thank you all again so much for joining us today for our session and letting us kind of review our policy areas. So thank you again. We hope you have a great rest of your night.